A man can stop time. With a single thought, the year is 1945. The world is shattered. Cities are dust. An empire built on 1,000 years of divine tradition has evaporated in the fire of two suns. The war is over, but for one soldier, hiding in the suffocating green of a forgotten island, the war has just begun. He has a rifle. He has his orders, and he has an unbreakable mind. This is the story of Hiroo Onoda, and the 29-year war fought not for territory, but for a single, sacred promise. The story does not begin in the jungle. It begins in a classroom unlike any other in Japan. This was the Nakano School, the Imperial Army's covert training ground for intelligence and unconventional warfare. Young Hiroo Onoda was not trained to be a soldier in the traditional sense. He was not trained to march in lines or fight in massive frontal assaults. He was trained to be a ghost. He was taught to disappear. He was taught that his true weapon was not the Arisaka rifle he would carry, but his mind. He was taught how to live off the land, how to build networks, how to melt into the shadows, and, above all, how to disrupt, deceive, and endure. The core of his training was psychological. He was taught that the enemy would be relentless, not just with bullets, but with lies. He was warned that the war might go badly. He was told the enemy would use every trick to break his spirit. They would drop leaflets declaring victory. They would use loudspeakers to broadcast false news of surrender. They would even use his own family's words against him. His duty was to interpret all of this, every last word, as a sophisticated deception. His mission was to see through the lies and continue the fight, to believe nothing, to trust no one, to hold. In December of 1944, the war in the Pacific was a roaring inferno, and the Philippines was its white-hot center. Onoda, a bright-eyed, sharp-witted lieutenant of 22, was sent to the small, unremarkable island of Lubang. It was a strategic backwater, but a potential stepping stone for American forces. His orders came from his direct superior, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. Those orders were precise, absolute, and seared into his memory. He was to lead a guerrilla force. He was to destroy the airstrip. He was to sabotage the harbor. He was to hold the island until the Imperial Army returned in triumph. Onoda, perhaps sensing the desperation in the air, asked a question. What if the mission becomes untenable? What if I am captured? Major Taniguchi looked him in the eye. The command he gave in response was the key that would turn the lock on Hiroo Onoda's world for 3 decades. Surrender is forbidden. It is not an option. You will not, under any circumstances, give up your life voluntarily. Your mission is absolute. We will come back for you. Until that day, you are to lead your men. This order stands. Weeks later, the Americans landed. The battle for Lubang was swift, brutal, and utterly one-sided. The main Japanese garrison was annihilated. Onoda, true to his training, ordered his men to scatter into the dense, mountainous jungle. They would fight as ghosts. As the American flags were raised and the transports moved on, the world began to heal. The war ended. But for Onoda and the few men who found him in the jungle's green cathedral, the war was simply entering a new, quieter, and more patient phase. He had his orders. The Imperial Army would return. His war began with 4. There was Corporal Shoichi Shimada, Private First Class Kinshichi Kozuka, and Private Yuichi Akatsu. Together, they formed a cell, a tiny breathing pocket of the defunct Japanese Empire. Their new life was a grueling routine of survival and mission. They were not merely hiding. They were, in their minds, an active combat unit. They rationed their dwindling ammunition. They patched their rotting uniforms with fibers they stripped from plants. They moved their camp constantly, fearing discovery. And they observed. The jungle itself was a living, breathing entity. It was not a sanctuary. It was a prison that provided just enough to survive. They learned the secret language of the island. They learned to hunt bats and forage for plants they'd never seen. Their primary food became the green, tough bananas from the local farms, which they would slice thin and dry over a low, smokeless fire, creating a crude, long-lasting ration. The humidity was a physical weight. It clung to their skin, rotted their clothes, and encouraged a universe of insects that feasted on them relentlessly. The smell of their world was the smell of damp earth, of mildew, of cold wood smoke, and the sharp, metallic tang of their rifles, which they cleaned with religious devotion. The rifle was their connection to their identity. To let it rust was to let their spirit die. In October of 1945, they had their first true test. A B-17 bomber flew low over the valley, but instead of bombs, it dropped paper. Millions of leaflets fluttered down, blanketing the jungle floor. Onoda and his men gathered one. It was the surrender order from General Yamashita himself. They read the words, they studied the paper, and they came to a chillingly logical conclusion. This was the first great deception. The enemy was clever. Of course they would forge a document from a high-ranking general. Their training at Nakano had been explicit. The enemy will try to trick you into surrender. This leaflet was not an end to the war. It was the proof that the war continued. They fired a single shot at the plane as it flew away, a gesture of defiance. More leaflets came. Newspapers were left on jungle paths, showing pictures of a defeated, occupied Japan. They found a radio, left by a search party, and heard voices speaking of a post-war world. Onoda and his men listened, and they interpreted. The news spoke of poverty and struggle in Japan. This, they concluded, was propaganda to make them believe Japan was too weak to fight. The voices spoke of peace. This was a lie to lull them into a trap. They were intelligence officers. Their job was to read between the lines. And between the lines, they saw a war still raging, a war of information. They were the last bastion, the only ones who had not fallen for the trick. This absolute certainty, this perfect shared reality, was the glue that held their tiny unit together. They were a family, bound by a purpose that the rest of the world had forgotten. But the human mind is a fragile thing. After 5 years of this relentless, grinding survival, the first crack appeared. Private Akatsu, the youngest, began to waver. The hunger, the isolation, the sheer hopelessness of their situation began to wear him down. He saw the new jeeps on the island roads. He saw the healthy, laughing villagers. He began to doubt. In 1949, he slipped away from the group. He walked out of the jungle, hands in the air, and surrendered to the Philippine police. For Onoda, Shimada, and Kozuka, this was not a surrender. It was a catastrophic security breach. Akatsu, they believed, had been captured. He had broken. He would be tortured. He would tell the enemy their locations, their methods, their entire world. Their paranoia, already high, reached a fever pitch. They retreated deeper into the mountains. They became more ruthless, more silent, more ghostly. They were now not just fighting a war. They were being hunted by an enemy who knew their secrets. The story of Hiroo Onoda is not just one of survival. It is one of sacrifice, endurance, and a level of loyalty that is difficult for the modern mind to comprehend. If you find this dedication to a forgotten cause as fascinating as we do, this is a perfect time to subscribe to our channel. We are dedicated to uncovering these lost chapters of human history, the stories of courage and conviction that echo long after the battles are over. Click that subscribe button and join us on this journey into the heart of the past. The 1950s became a decade of iron-willed routine. The 3 remaining men refined their existence. Their world shrank to a few square miles of unforgiving mountain jungle. They lived by the seasons. The dry season meant a risk of fire, but easier travel. The rainy season, the Amihan, was a miserable, wet hell. The rain would fall for weeks, a deafening, constant drumming that soaked them to the bone and chilled their spirit. It was a time of sickness, of doubt. They huddled under makeshift lean-tos, the smell of wet canvas and unwashed bodies thick in the air. In this liquid world, Sound was their greatest ally and enemy. They learned to distinguish the sound of a wild boar from the sound of a man. They could hear the metallic click of a rifle bolt from 100 yards away. They lived in a state of heightened sensory awareness, their bodies thin and tough as whipcord, their minds sharpened to a razor's edge. They continued their mission. They conducted reconnaissance, sketching maps of the new police stations and the improved U.S. radar installation on the coast. They saw this new construction not as a sign of peace, but as an escalation. The enemy was fortifying the island. This meant the Japanese counter-invasion must be approaching. Their duty was to harass, to disrupt, to remind the occupiers that the island was not truly theirs. This harassment led to conflict. They were not passive castaways. They were soldiers. They stole cattle from local farmers for food. They set fires to rice fields, an act of agricultural sabotage. And inevitably, this led to gunfire. The local police, and sometimes armed farmers, formed search parties. They were no longer searching for stragglers. They were hunting bandits. In June of 1953, a letter and photographs of Onoda's own family were left on a trail. He found them. He saw the faces of his parents, his brothers. He read their words, pleading for him to come home, telling him the war was over. His heart ached. The pull of his old life, of a warm bed, of a mother's face, was a physical pain. But his training kicked in. He looked at the photograph. He studied his brother's clothes. They looked different, too modern. He read the letter. The phrasing felt stilted, wrong. This, he concluded, was the most cruel deception yet. To use his own family against him, he steeled his heart. He burned the letters. His resolve did not break. It hardened. A year later, the war became personal. In May of 1954, a search party cornered them on a rocky hillside. The air exploded with gunfire. It was a chaotic, desperate skirmish. Bullets ricocheted off the wet stones. Onoda and Kozuka laid down covering fire. Corporal Shimada, his oldest companion in this long war, tried to move to a new position. A single shot rang out, different from the sound of their Arisakas. Shimada fell. He was shot in the leg. Onoda and Kozuka rushed to him, but the patrol was advancing. They couldn't carry him. Shimada, knowing his wound was mortal and that he would slow them down, ordered them to go. He would hold the line. Onoda's mind fractured. To leave a man behind was the ultimate sin, but to stay was to fail the mission. As they scrambled back into the dense foliage, they heard the final sounds of the fight, and then silence. Now they were two. The bond between Hiroo Onoda and Kinshichi Kozuka became something deeper than brotherhood. For the next 18 years, they were the only two human beings in their reality. They were the entire Imperial Japanese Army on Lubang. They spoke in short, clipped sentences. They moved with an unconscious synchronization, two parts of a single organism. They were each other's memory, each other's sanity. The world outside continued to spin faster and faster. The 1960s dawned. Onoda and Kozuka, now in their 40s, saw strange new things. They saw jet aircraft slicing the sky, leaving white trails. They saw new, powerful ships on the horizon. They heard radios broadcasting news of a Cold War, of a place called Vietnam, of men walking on the moon. And they interpreted, the jets? New weapons for the ongoing war. The ships, American reinforcements, clearly worried about the coming Japanese invasion. The moon landing? A fantastic piece of American propaganda, a desperate fantasy to boost morale. How could a nation at war, which they believed America to be, possibly spare the resources for such a stunt? Every piece of new information was taken, examined, and hammered into a shape that fit their 1944 worldview. Their belief was no longer just a mission. It was a fortress. It was the only thing that gave meaning to the death of Shimada, the defection of Akatsu, and their own grinding daily sacrifice. As the years passed, their bodies aged. The relentless dampness crept into their joints. Their teeth ached, but their skills remained sharp. They could still disappear in seconds. Their rifles were still spotless. Their few remaining rounds of ammunition counted and recounted. They were two old men, ghosts in a world that had forgotten them, still fighting a war that had ended before many of the new police officers hunting them had even been born. This is the halfway point of their journey, the moment of greatest isolation, when the duo became a single, lonely survivor. The story of Onoda and Kazuka is a testament to the power of a shared belief, a pact that transcended time itself. But the final chapter, the story of the last man, is where the true test of the human spirit is found. If you are moved by this profound loyalty, we ask you to share this story. There are countless tales of forgotten heroes, and by sharing this, you help us ensure their legacy is not lost to the jungle of time. October 1972. Onoda was 50. Kazuka was 51. They were on a routine mission. They were burning rice stubble, a small act of sabotage they had performed countless times. But this time, they were seen. A police patrol, armed with modern automatic rifles, spotted the smoke. The officers opened fire. The sound was deafening, a modern rip that tore the air apart. It was not the single-shot crack of the rifles they were used to. Kazuka, Onoda's brother in time, his only human contact for 18 years, was hit. He stumbled, fell. Onoda, acting on pure instinct, dove into the undergrowth, bullets shredding the leaves around his head. He crawled, scrambling through the mud, his heart a cold stone in his chest. He made it to the river and disappeared. He waited. He listened. There was shouting, and then silence. He crept back hours later. Kazuka was gone. The police had taken his body. Hiroo Onoda was, for the first time in 27 years, completely, totally, and absolutely alone. The psychological weight of this moment is almost impossible to comprehend. His last link to his old reality was severed. The mission, to be carried out by his men, was now impossible. He was the only one left. Any rational mind would have broken. Any rational mind would have seen the futility, the waste. But Onoda was not rational. He was trained. His mind, forged in the Nakano school, did not collapse. It contracted. It became a single hard point of light. His duty was no longer to fight. His duty was to endure, to observe, to survive until the Imperial Army returned. He was the last sentinel. He became even more cautious. He became a true ghost. He stopped lighting fires. He ate his bananas raw. He lived in a burrow he dug into the hillside, concealed by vines. His world was the green dark, the sound of his own breathing, and the crushing, profound silence of his solitude. He was the last soldier of a long-dead empire, a living monument to a forgotten order. For another year and a half, he held his lonely vigil. His uniform was a patchwork of rags. His body was scarred and thin, but his rifle was clean, and his mind was clear. Then, in February of 1974, the pattern was broken. A new sound. Someone was in his territory. Not a farmer, not a police patrol. This person was different. He was singing. Onoda watched from the shadows. The man was young, Japanese, with long hair. He was setting up a small tent. He looked like a student, a tourist. He was an anomaly. Onoda, driven by a loneliness he hadn't allowed himself to feel, and a deep-seated suspicion, decided to make contact. He emerged from the jungle, his rifle leveled. "Stop!" he commanded. The young man spun around. His eyes went wide. He was not afraid. He was ecstatic. "Onoda-san?" he asked. "You are Lieutenant Onoda?" The young man's name was Norio Suzuki. He was an adventurer, a college dropout, who had told his friends he was going to find Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman in that order. He had found the most elusive of the three. Suzuki sat down. He spoke to Onoda not as a soldier, not as a fanatic, but as a man. He spoke of the new Japan. He spoke of bullet trains and televisions. He spoke with a kindness and an earnestness that bypassed Onoda's 30 years of counter-propaganda training. He pulled out a radio, and they listened to a modern broadcast. He took photographs. For the first time, Onoda listened. He saw in Suzuki's eyes not deception, but a simple, unbelievable truth. But even then, his conditioning held. He told Suzuki that he was a soldier. He could not surrender. He could not leave his post unless he was formally relieved of duty by his commanding officer. Suzuki returned to Japan with his photographs. The nation was stunned. The ghost of Lubang was real. The Japanese government, moved by this impossible story of loyalty, embarked on one last search. They found him, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, the man who had given the order. He was no longer a major in an imperial army. He was an old man. He worked in a bookstore. On March 9, 1974, Major Taniguchi was flown to Lubang. He was brought to a prearranged clearing in the jungle. Onoda, waiting, saw his former commander approach. He was in a modern suit, but he walked with the same military bearing. Onoda's mind finally accepted the truth. He clicked his heels together. His body, frail and aged, snapped to attention. He was a soldier reporting for duty. Major Taniguchi, his voice heavy with the weight of 3 decades, stood before him and read the formal proclamation. Imperial General Headquarters Order. All combat units are ordered to cease combat operations. The war has been over for 29 years. You are relieved of your duties, Hiroo Onoda heard the words. The key that had locked his world in 1944 was finally turned. He stepped back. He began to unbuckle his sword, the one he had kept pristine for a war that had ended. His hands trembled. He presented the sword to his major, and for the first time in 29 years, Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, the last soldier, broke down and wept. He returned to a Japan he could not recognize. It was a land of chrome, glass, and noise. He was a hero, a relic, a symbol of a past that his new country had tried hard to forget. He was a man out of time, a living ghost. He pardoned the farmers he had fought, and they pardoned him. He was a samurai in a world of computers. He could not stay. The new Japan was not his. He moved to Brazil, to the quiet plains, where he became a cattle rancher. He found a peace in the open sky that the jungle had denied him. But his story was not over. He eventually returned to Japan, and he used his experiences not to teach war, but to teach survival. He ran a nature school for children, teaching them the lessons of the jungle, how to endure, how to observe, and how to find strength within themselves. Hiroo Onoda's story is not one of madness. It is not perhaps even one of war. It is a story about the terrifying, awesome, and devastating power of human belief. It is a testament to the idea that a mind, when locked onto a purpose, can build a reality stronger than time, stronger than evidence, stronger even than the world itself. His war was not fought against the world. It was fought to keep a promise. He held his post. He did not surrender. He was the last soldier, guarding an empire that existed only in his memory. And in the end, in his own way, he won. He kept his word. The past is not a dead thing. It is alive, and it lives in stories of profound human conviction. The tale of Hiroo Onoda is one of the most powerful we have ever had the honor to tell. If you believe that these stories of sacrifice and endurance deserve to be heard, that they teach us something vital about ourselves, then please subscribe to our channel. Help us continue to search for the ghosts of history, and to give them a voice so that their echo may never fade.